Okay, here we go, yet another one on unpacking the mental prison, guys. This is all about being able to see the world for how it really is, as opposed to the way you've been mentally conditioned to see it, and for those who are brave enough to take that step. And it's pretty scary, so that's why I see a lot of resistance. And so if you're one of those who's ready to resist, obviously not for you, move along. If you have some kind of curiosity to see if you can move forward and get the value out of being able to get that mental clarity that actually helps you come into your own, then there might be some value here for you. So this image, obviously everyone remembers that when they did the big barrage of pepper spray in Melbourne and they just charged at people. So I'm going to go into starting with Larkin. He's going to talk about the true nature of government and the mental slavery that's required to allow it to exist the way it is.
I constantly refer to government as an institution which commits violent aggression against people. It coercively and aggressively robs and dominates people. And pretty often I will see people saying, well, what do you mean violent? They're not violent to me. What are you talking about? They all the way don't know why I would say such a thing. And it has so much to do with perceptions and assumptions. And I'll use the analogy of a slave who grew up being taught that you are the rightful property of somebody else. And a lot of slaves believe that. They were taught to believe that, to the point that they would actually view themselves as thieves if they were to steal themselves from their masters / owners by running away. And if you don't believe me, go read the works of Frederick Douglass, who was himself a slave for many years, who describes the mentality and describes his own process of getting out of that indoctrination, which to me is way more impressive. Like his mental evolution, given the situation he was in, is just astonishing. The physical escape from slavery to me is sort of that's impressive. Good job. It's perfectly legitimate, but not all that impressive. But his mental escape and the way he describes the process of going through that is just amazing.
So this is critical, guys. So most of us can tell, when there's a physical enslavement, when we see someone being whipped, that's pretty obvious. It's hard to hide that. What very few can tell is how their mind is enslaved and being whipped in different ways. And so this is what this is about, is how you yourself, by imagining that you're not to pay tax, that you're not bound to pay that kind of stuff, or that you're not bound to permits and rates and application fees, etc. They're not an obligation. Like most people cannot envision that there's something immoral about that. They just don't have the capacity. So that's the mental whipping, right? As opposed to the physical one, is that you are held in that cage believing that you have some obligation, that makes you a good moral person, right? To strip yourself of your earnings to give to someone else who just demands it of you. And that's pretty much the equal version of it, of how it's done when you're not physically whipped. It's how it's done when you're mentally whipped. And you do it to yourself, because for you to stop doing that is the same as a slave believing that by them escaping physically, that they're stealing themselves from their rightful masters, because they're their master's property. Well, we who believe in these kind of things about what we're duty bound to do are immediately the property of someone else, because our mind is owned. So without our mind being owned, our body can't be owned. And so that's what he's getting into. So we're going to move on to the next thing, and we're going to see that in the physical realm.
Remember this?
So there you have it, guys. They actively showed you that you are their slaves, because if you weren't, they wouldn't be allowed to do this, right? It means you've been condoning it by the sheer fact that you give your force and weight and consent to this structure by voting for it and paying into it. Right? That's the really important thing, every time you pay some version of tax, no matter all the different versions they are, you are paying into your own slavery, because that's how they pay their enforcers to come and whip you, which is what you just saw a moment ago. So this is the mental cage that we need to start moving out of and seeing things for how they really are.
His mental escape and the way he describes the process of going through that is just amazing. But he describes the fact that a lot of the slaves thought slavery was proper. It was legitimate. They were the property of somebody else and had to behave accordingly. So when people say, well, government isn't violence, what are you talking about? It always brings to mind the slave that says, well, what do you mean the master's violent? He's never whipped me because I always do what he says. And I work really, really hard for him, and he takes all the fruits of my labor.
What does that sound like to you guys? Is that not the one who gloats about the amount of tax they pay? You know, that I'm a good tax-paying citizen? Is that not the same thing? You know, I pay my dues, you know, I make my choices, I vote, I pay tax, you know, yada, 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 right? It's the modern day version of the plantation slave. No different. It's just that you can't see it because you've got some comforts. That's the only difference. That's what's being laid out here, if you're willing to see it.
And I do what he says, and I never talk back, and I bow, and I grovel, and I do all those things. So he's never violent at me.
You think about how many people say that. Like, well, if you just obey the law, you won't have a problem. And that's the thing, right? Because what is the law? That's how it's done. Is it actual verifiable that's universal to all of us? Or is it the actual whims and prejudices of the ruling class? Which one is it? Because who gets to set it? It's all there, guys. It's the ones who get to set and decide what it is. They're the ones that you're obeying. And they just get away with it by just calling it a law and giving themselves the authority to do it. And you grant them the authority by voting for them to do that. That's how they get away with it.
And the thing is that misses the inherent violence of the threat behind it. So when somebody says, well, government's never used violence against me, oh, so you just pay taxes to be nice because you want to, you fill out those forms, and you pay taxes on everything you buy, and you pay taxes on your income, and you pay taxes on this and that and the other thing, just to be nice? Like there's no threat of force? Well, I mean, you have to do that. I mean, you have to obey, or there are consequences. Yeah, the consequences are called violence. They will take your stuff, or ultimately they'll take you and put you in a cage if you disobey openly enough. But to people who imagine that domination is legitimate and legal, they often don't view it as violence because they think the violence is justified. So it's like, well, they didn't commit violence against me, and if I disobey their laws, and then they have to, and I make them enforce it on me, well, that's my fault because I wasn't a good subject.
I actually recall, and I've said this in other videos, actually having someone say that to me when they found out that the police were a private corporation. They actually said, I don't care that they're a private corporation as long as they keep me safe. So in their minds is, well, as long as I keep doing the right thing, what the good person does, it doesn't matter what they are. You know what I mean? As long as I'm safe. So you have modern day expressions of that. It's there for you to see if you want to see it.
I wasn't a good law-abiding taxpayer. And a lot of people view it that way, that it doesn't count as violence because government has the right to do it. It doesn't count as even domination because, well, they passed the laws, and if you break the law, well, then it's on you. It's your own damn fault. Doesn't matter what the law is, because our glorious and noble and all-loving masters, our lawmakers, can legislate whatever they want, and it's our job to obey. And if we don't obey, well, then whatever they do to us is our own damn fault. And
that's really, really critical, guys. It's about understanding the mental prison that enslaves people and what they've accepted and how they've overridden their innate intelligence that knows otherwise. And why have they done it? That's the thing. Why do people do that? It's really important to understand why you would override your innate intelligence. And it starts back right down at early childhood, how you were treated when you started expressing your innate intelligence. you learnt that that brought you suffering. And so it's about really acknowledging that on the individual level. And if you can do that, then you've got a chance to move forward. So I'm going to move to this next one. This is really what's on offer here, guys, right? It's the mental slavery, right? I get lots of flack about this because people see me as discrediting others who are still enslaved, who are, pitch themselves as being freedom fighters and free thinkers and, some kind of leader in the freedom movement. And then when I expose the level of contradiction and the lack of principle that they operate from, that their followers can't handle it, and they just see me as tearing down the freedom movement, etc. Well, the thing about truth is that no matter how many people accept a lie, it doesn't actually diminish the lie just because the majority share in it. And you've got different levels of slavery. It doesn't change. Just because you can see one level of deception, but you can't see the next, it's still deception. So you're still enslaved. And this is what it's about. It's about getting past all of it and getting that mental clarity that's necessary. So mental slavery is the worst form of slavery. It gives you the illusion of freedom, makes you trust and love and defend your oppressor while making an enemy of those who are trying to free you and open your eyes. So that's pretty much, I live that most of the time when I put stuff out that a lot of people get offended over, because obviously it's too much for them to hold in that moment. And they just, my guess is, their organism can't hold it, so the easy thing is just to turn on the one that's giving the information. Okay, now we're going to see how this looks in real time. Here we go.
Well, it turns out police were going easy on the public. There's a little known law on the books in Victoria that gives police the power to do pretty much anything, including killing people if they fail to move on after being told to do so. And here's the important part: in the name of the king. Now, this law, inherited from England, is called the Riot Act.
It's really important to understand that, guys. See how he said law? Something that is law, man cannot write. So obviously it's not law. These are the whims and prejudices and arbitrary desires of people who hide in the shadows, who want absolute power. But obviously they need to give it that expression and call it law, so then you think that there's no way to challenge it, that it's an authority bigger than anybody. And the ones who are enforcing it are just doing the right thing. That's the mental prison. Right? And then he just said it then, a Riot Act. What's an act? Is that not something that Parliament does? Right? And if they're meant to be public servants under the correct system, how could they possibly have any power to make it okay that people cannot be prosecuted for killing others? Right? It's right there. So the police are your slavery enforcers. They are like the ones who round up the slaves and make sure they don't get out of their pens. That's their job, and it's been like that. Look, it's in 1860, wrote it then, right back then. And anyone who's a monarch who has this in place it just shows you that they are actually acting outside the confines of what they're supposed to be doing, because no correct monarch under the correct system has the power to allow that. It's just the ignorance of the people that allowed it. So like I said, a lie is no less a lie just because the majority share in it. And that's a really difficult concept for many to grasp. But you need to understand how it works. If one man doesn't have the right to harm another, it doesn't exist, or have authority over another, how can that be delegated out to a group of people with a title? Right? It can't exist. So it has to be a mental trick that's in place. Right? So this just shows you those people who are all the Constitution of 1901, that's all legit. No, it's not, because look what was already in place before that was even made a thing. Right, so that particular monarch of the day was a criminal. So as soon as they act criminally, that entire structure dissolves. It doesn't have any validity. So it's more evidence for all you 1901 constitutional lovers, right, that it never was legitimate. It was always a crime. So let's listen on.
Basically, it works like this. If a magistrate or a justice of the peace...
Now remember, they're meant to be public servants. Now how does someone who's meant to be in service to the public get this next bit of power?
Reads a prepared statement to a crowd telling them to move on in the name of the sovereign, they've got 1 hour to do so. And if they fail to do so, the law, the Riot Act, still on the books in Victoria, states, and I quote, if persons so unlawfully, riotously and tumultuously assembled happen to be, killed, maimed or hurt in the dispersing, the offenders, that is the police, shall be free, discharged and indemnified of, for and concerning the killing, maiming or hurting of any such person unlawfully assembled as aforesaid. Now, this came to light yesterday when MPs were dealing with a bill to remove references to the sovereign or the monarchy from various pieces of legislation. Now, MPs voted to remove references to the Queen from this particular act, but left the act itself, which indemnifies police from killing citizens who failed to move on from a protest, on the statute books.
So that's really, really important information there, guys. You see how they're doing it. If you don't believe these politicians are criminal and this is not enough evidence, I'm not sure what else you need to see. They're always going to be criminal when they're in a position where they have immunity, right? Where they're not accountable. That's always going to make criminality. So now they're removing the last vestiges of any kind of breaks on them being able to do whatever the hell they want. And that just takes the people to understand it, because it won't change until the people make it stop. And before you can make it stop, you need to be able to see it for what it is. That's the point of why I do these videos, is for you to see it for how it actually is. Now, what all this is about, if you really want to understand it in simplistic terms, it's the same as a plantation owner just getting out in the field and reading out a bunch of stuff they just wrote out that tells the slaves how they're going to be appropriated from this point onwards, and they just have to take it. So if you actually were sovereign, you'd never be being subjected to this. If you were actually free, you would never be subjected to any of these decrees. That's just the same thing. It's a plantation owner's decree, and you're the property. That's what they're basically saying, and that was way back in 1860, guys, right? And then these people say, oh, the police are different then, blah, blah. That was all a smokescreen. They were building up to this moment. You know, that was already set in play over, what, nearly 200 years ago now, if I did my maths right? Or did I not do that right? No, I think that's less. Anyway, I don't want to do my maths now. And so bottom line is, that was set up. It was always coming down the pike. It's just whether you're willing to see it, right? How much more evidence do you require? They've always been, the political class has always been a smokescreen for your master. That's what it's really meant the whole time. Maybe you had a nicer time of it, but that didn't mean you were any less of a slave. It's the same as like if you were a chattel slave on a plantation and you were auctioned off to a nicer master. That's what happened for those years that, you know, most people were comfortable. You had a nicer master, but you were still a slave. That didn't change. You know, so it's always been sitting there. It's up to the people now as to whether they want to take action and do something about it. That's really what matters, because nothing's going to stop it unless the people come together behind the truth. You know, so that's why we've been using the MC 1215, because that's the correct setup. The Magna Carta 1215 is the correct setup for all versions of governance across the Commonwealth. Doesn't matter if it's in different countries, it's all structured around the one place, and that is that there can only be a system of law that's got to do with morality, and that's the moral compasses of the community that drives it through trial by jury. That's the actual highest law council that can exist in any kind of structured society. And if you don't use it, that means you are making yourself property of your masters. And this is what you have the opportunity to change if you care enough. And it takes more than one to do it. It takes a collective of people. So it's just you taking the choice to go, okay, I care enough now.
The whole legal system and all their written crap, the entire purpose of the written system of law is not what you were taught in school. The entire purpose of the written system of law is to pretend to the subject class that it's actually knowable and applies to everybody, and that there are principles involved, and that it's predictable, and there's fairness, and there's due process. No, there's a whole bunch of legalese noise to hide the fact that they do whatever the hell they want, and the only limitation is at what point the people will actually resist.
So that's why you need to remove the mental prison, guys, because that's what's stopping the resistance. It's right there in your face. It's just whether you will have the courage to do something about it, because the laws of nature are such that if you do nothing, you'll get what you've been given, and that makes you a slave. And so if you're still unclear about the legal system, just think about how many times Daniel Andrews used to say, well, it doesn't matter what people do because it's illegal. There's your screen right there, right? And here's the actual definition. The legal definition of the word legal is the undoing of God's law. It makes so much sense because through that, they get to make themselves gods. That's the point. That's why they do it. So if you're ready to activate, this is for you. So if you're ready to act, guys, you just go to magnacarta1215.com. There it is. You'll click on News and Articles. This will take you here. And then you just scroll down. And you'll see here there's a cover letter to download, and then there's the 12 points. It's like a flyer. So just showing the cover letter. There it is up here. It's always officer in charge, because that way it goes to whoever's the highest ranking officer on that day when they get the mail. The red part is just showing the editable bits, so you will change that obviously in accordance with the station that you're sending to, and then just change to black after that. But I just want to scroll down quickly. I want to go to this bit here where it talks about what's coming for them down the pike when enough people work it out, and the correct system that we're supposed to be working under, which is trial by jury, where the people assess the crimes committed against them, because they're the victims of it. So who's better to assess it than we're the victims, and the consciousness of the community, because there's a neutral space there. So it just says that, you know, they won't be standing in front of any government-appointed judges, magistrates, or court officers, because they're their protection right. They've created a legal protection network, which is just a way to conceal crime. So that will be gone. They won't have that. And then it just says what's coming from them down the pike is the things that they're looking at: trespass, assaults, thefts, extortions, threats with menaces, malfeasance in public office, etc. Are most severe for sworn officers of the law who brazenly and without apparent remorse assume the role of criminals, which is pretty much what they're doing, hands down. There's not one there that could get away with it. The office offences extend all the way to sedition, which means publicly denying the validity of the Constitution, and misprision of treason and high treason, which carry respectively the punishments of full asset stripping and life in prison or even the gallows. Then it goes on to say 2 final points for consideration. 1, people who commit crimes at the behest of others are always vulnerable to the risk that the order givers might decide to tidy up loose ends by disposing of the order followers preemptively. An example of which is given in the second QR code. And the other one is, most people are of the type willing to grant clemency to those who display remorse or are willing to assist in the apprehension or cessation of ongoing crimes. So it's just signed Commonwealth Constitutional Alliance. So it's all covered, guys. You don't have to put your name to it, anything like that. And there's the 12 points there. I've covered it in previous videos. So that's all the QR codes that are on there. I'm not going to read into it too much. You guys can read it into your own time. It's pretty potent, powerful. So that's all I wanted to show you. So if you're ready to back it, it's all done for you. You just need to put it together and shove it in an envelope. And you've got instructions on the website of how to do that.